Welcome to Brainwaves and Breakthroughs.
You ever get that feeling like the whole world's on the move? I mean, people migrating, shifting. It's always happening,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. Always has been, always will be, I guess.
Right. But this deep dive, this one is going to kind of put that into a whole new perspective, I think.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
We're diving into the great climate exodus.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that one's, that's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, it's not exactly light reading, but I think it's a crucial conversation we need to be having.
Definitely. I mean, just the title alone, The Great Climate Exodus, tells you we're not just talking about people moving for better opportunities anymore. This is about survival.
Exactly. This is about climate-induced migration. And this excerpt, it doesn't just tell us what's happening. It takes us to the where, the why, through some pretty heavy real-world examples.
Yeah, some of those stories, they really stay with you.
Right. Like it just paints this really stark picture. Imagine whole communities forced to abandon their homes because of the changing climate. I mean, this is happening right now.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's only going to get more intense.
And that's the scary part. So,
Yeah.
yeah, buckle up because this is a deep dive into some serious stuff.
Absolutely. And it's not some distant future we're talking about either. This is happening right now. The excerpt, it opens with this look at rising sea levels, which, I mean, it's already displacing communities today.
Yeah, the Carteret Islands in Papua New Guinea, they come to mind immediately.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, their story is just, it's so powerful. This excerpt really brings it to life, I think. Their home is literally vanishing beneath the waves.
It is. It's heartbreaking. And they've had to relocate to Bougainville. They've become some of the world's first climate refugees.
Climate refugees, it's a term we're hearing more and more, and it's mind-boggling to think about the scale of it.
It is. And what's fascinating is that the excerpt, it goes beyond just that physical relocation, you know?
Yeah.
It delves into the cultural loss, the struggle to adapt to a whole new way of life.
Right, like imagine having to leave behind generations of tradition, your connection to the land,
Yes.
everything you've ever known, just gone.
And it doesn't stop there. There are land disputes with the communities they're moving to. You know, it's like this cascade of challenges, one after another. They're trying to rebuild their lives, but it's
Oh.
it's almost impossible.
It's almost unfathomable, isn't it? To have your whole way of life, your sense of place, just swept away.
It is. And that same existential threat, it's looming over the Maldives.
Oh, the Maldives, yeah.
They're 80% just 1 meter above sea level.
1 meter. That really puts it into perspective, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, what happens when the water rises just a little bit more? Where do they go?
Exactly. The excerpt, it talks about how they're responding, building artificial islands, relocating communities. I mean, that's got to be incredibly expensive, right?
Oh, hugely. And the excerpt raises some really interesting questions at whether it's even a viable long-term solution.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds more like a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, doesn't it?
Yeah, it might buy them some time, but it's not a sustainable fix. Not really.
So if even a wealthy nation like the Maldives is struggling to adapt, what does that mean for other low-lying nations?
Exactly.
Places like the Mekong Delta in Vietnam.
Right.
Millions of people live there. And this excerpt, it doesn't sugarcoat the risks they're facing.
No, not at all. And it's not necessarily that immediate flooding that's the primary concern there. It's something called saltwater intrusion.
Saltwater intrusion, what's that?
So basically, as the sea level rises, it pushes saltwater into the farmland, which essentially it poisons the land, makes it unusable for growing crops.
Oh, wow, I see.
And that has huge implications, obviously, for the people who depend on that land for their livelihoods.
So it's not just the immediate threat of displacement, it's this slow creeping erosion of their way of life.
Exactly. And it triggers this whole other set of problems, as the excerpt points out. It drives internal migration as people are forced to abandon their farms and they head to the cities for work, for opportunities.
Right, I can see that happening.
Which then puts this massive strain on resources and infrastructure in urban areas. It's like this glimpse into what we might see on a larger scale in other regions as this climate pressure continues to build.
It's like this domino effect, right?
Yeah.
One thing leads to another, and suddenly you've got this massive upheaval.
Exactly. And the scary part is this is just rising sea levels, right? We haven't even talked about the impact of extreme weather events yet. And the connection to climate change, well, It's pretty undeniable at this point.
Yeah, Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, that's a stark example.
Yeah.
The images of the devastation, the sheer number of people displaced, over 1 million,
Yeah.
and many of them never returned home. It's still etched in my memory.
It's a powerful reminder of the destructive force of nature and how unprepared we often are for these kinds of events.
And it's not just about the immediate impact either. This excerpt, it highlights the ripple effects, the demographic shifts, the strained resources in receiving areas. Have we really learned the lessons from Katrina, though?
I'm not sure we have.
It makes you wonder, are we even prepared for the next Katrina, let alone the ones that come after that?
That's a really good question. And it's not just hurricanes either, right? We're seeing prolonged droughts in the Sahel region of Africa, massive floods in Asia, wildfires raging out of control.
Yeah, the excerpt talks about how climate change, it acts as this threat multiplier.
It does. It takes existing problems like poverty, conflict, lack of resources, and it amplifies them. So you've got millions of people being forced into this desperate search for survival. The human cost is unimaginable.
Yeah, I mean, Cyclone Idai hitting Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi just a few years back, that's a perfect and devastating example.
Absolutely.
Those images. It felt like the world just stood still, watching this tragedy unfold.
Yeah, and the excerpt makes a crucial point. These aren't isolated incidents anymore. They're becoming more frequent, more severe, putting more and more people at risk. It's a terrifying trend, and honestly, it's only going to get worse.
So we've got rising seas, extreme weather events, but there's another piece to this climate migration puzzle, right? The excerpt calls it resource scarcity. What's the takeaway there?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. The excerpt, it throws out this startling statistic. Agricultural yields in Africa, they could plummet by 50% by 2020 due to climate change. Think about what that means for food security, for political stability.
50%, that's a huge drop.
It is. It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it's not just an environmental issue anymore. That's a global security issue. It's mind-boggling.
It is. And the excerpt does a fantastic job of connecting the dots, I think. Shrinking farmland, crop failures, economic turmoil. It's this chain reaction that ripples out across the globe.
It's like one domino falls and then another and another.
Exactly. And suddenly you've got mass migrations, political instability, conflicts over dwindling resources. It's a whole new world order.
Okay, so we're talking about a potential 50% drop in agricultural yields in Africa by 2020. That's not just an environmental issue anymore, right? That's a global security issue.
Exactly. Yeah, it becomes a human issue, a humanitarian issue.
It's mind-boggling.
It really is. In this excerpt, I think it does a fantastic job of connecting those dots, right?
Yeah.
Shrinking farmland, crop failures, and then the economic turmoil that results.
Right.
And it's this chain reaction that ripples out across the globe, and suddenly you've got mass migrations, you've got political instability, you've got conflicts erupting over these dwindling resources.
Right.
It's a whole new world order driven by this scarcity.
And it's not theoretical either, right? I mean, the excerpt brings up the Syrian civil war as a case in point.
Yeah, that's a really powerful example.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? Like, how does that fit into this picture?
Well, it's important to note that the excerpt isn't saying that climate change single-handedly caused the Syrian civil war.
Right.
It was a complex web of factors, for sure. But the Great Climate Exodus does argue that severe drought, which was likely intensified by climate change, played a significant role by leading to agricultural failures, economic hardship, and then social unrest, all of which contributed to the mass displacement of millions of people.
So climate change essentially added fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
Exacerbated these existing tensions and kind of pushed the whole situation over the edge.
Yeah, it tipped the scales.
It's a sobering thought.
It is.
And we're seeing similar patterns in other parts of the world, right? I mean, the excerpt talks about the shrinking of Lake Chad.
Oh, yeah.
Which is this vital water source in Africa.
Absolutely.
And it's shrunk by a staggering 90% since the 1960s.
It's incredible.
90%. I mean, that's almost impossible to comprehend.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
What's driving that kind of dramatic change?
It's a combination of factors, really, including drought and unsustainable water use. As the population grows, the demand for water increases, but the supply is dwindling.
Right. And with climate change, it's exacerbating the problem.
Exactly.
So what are the consequences of that? I mean, it sounds pretty dire.
It is.
The excerpt, it paints a pretty grim picture, right?
It does.
What happens when vital resource like that just disappears?
Well, you see competition for the resources that are left. You
Yeah.
see conflict erupt between communities, between countries even.
Wow.
You see millions of people displaced. You see poverty, food insecurity,
Right.
and even the rise of extremist groups, who are exploiting the instability and preying on the desperation of people.
It's like a breeding ground for all sorts of problems.
It is. It's a cautionary tale, really, of
Yeah.
what can happen when a vital resource disappears.
Yeah, it feels like a glimpse into a dystopian future, but it's happening right now.
It is. It's happening right now.
And it's not just happening over there either, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this excerpt also talks about how climate change-driven hardship in Guatemala is fueling migration to the U.S.
Right. Exactly. It's a global issue.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that this is a global issue with far-reaching consequences, and
Yeah.
it's affecting everyone.
Yeah, we're all kind of.
We've talked about rising seas, extreme weather, and resource scarcity, all pushing people from their homes.
Right.
But I think what really hits home for me is the human cost,
Absolutely.
the personal stories, the families that are torn apart, the communities that are shattered.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. It's the human face of climate change, and it's often overlooked.
It's easy to get lost in the statistics, the data, the science.
Right.
But at the end of the day, this is about people's lives.
It is.
And it raises a huge question. Who is responsible for protecting these climate migrants? Do we even have a system in place to handle this kind of mass displacement?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, as this excerpt points out, the current legal frameworks are, well, they're woefully inadequate.
So essentially, we're dealing with a 21st century problem with 20th century solutions.
Pretty much. Yeah.
That's not very reassuring.
No, it's not. And that's why this international cooperation is absolutely crucial.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, we need to come together as a global community to create a system that recognizes climate displacement, that provides legal protections for these migrants, and that ensures access to support for those forced to move.
Right.
It's a massive undertaking, but it's essential if we want to avoid a truly catastrophic situation.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem, we've laid out the stakes, but what can we actually do about this? Is there any way to turn the tide, so to speak?
Yeah, it can feel really overwhelming, right? Like, where do you even begin with a problem this massive?
Right, exactly.
But this excerpt, it does offer a roadmap of sorts, I think.
Okay.
It doesn't pretend that there's some magic bullet solution, but it points to a multifaceted approach, really. Focusing on mitigation, adaptation, and then international cooperation.
Okay, so let's unpack those a little bit. Mitigation, I get that. Like, we need to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions to slow down climate change itself, right?
Right.
But that feels like a long-term game.
It is. It is a long-term game.
What about the people who are being displaced right now?
Right, and that's where adaptation comes in. It's about empowering communities to become more resilient to the impacts of climate change that are already baked in, that are already happening.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, the excerpt offers some really inspiring examples, actually.
Okay.
Like farmers in drought-prone areas, they're experimenting with these drought-resistant crops.
Oh, interesting.
Coastal communities, they're building seawalls, they're restoring those natural barriers like mangroves.
So it's about working with nature, not against it.
Exactly. It's about shifting our mindset from one of control to one of adaptation, working within the constraints that we're facing.
Yeah, instead of trying to hold back the tide, we're learning to swim with it, kind of.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great analogy. And the excerpt, it highlights some really cutting-edge innovations in this space. Things like early warning systems for those extreme weather events, climate-resilient infrastructure, even planned relocation.
Oh, wow.
It's about thinking ahead and being proactive, to reduce those risks.
But let's be realistic for a second. Those solutions, they require resources, right?
They do.
Money, technology, expertise,
Yeah.
things that a lot of these vulnerable communities just don't have access to.
You've hit on a really crucial point, and this is where the excerpt stresses that absolute necessity of international cooperation.
Okay, so what does that look like?
Well, the argument is that developed countries, the ones who have, historically contributed the most to climate change,
Right.
they have a moral responsibility to support developing nations in their adaptation efforts. This means providing financial aid, technology transfer, capacity building, a global effort to really share the burden and find solutions together.
So it's almost like a global safety net, right?
Yeah, I like that.
We're acknowledging that climate change impacts us all, so we need to support each other.
Right.
But I remember the excerpt also talked about how inadequate our current legal frameworks are when it comes to climate migrants.
Right.
What needs to change there?
Yeah, that's a major gap for sure.
Yeah.
Right now, there's no universally recognized definition of a climate migrant, and there's no legal framework that's specifically designed to protect their rights.
Right.
So this leaves them incredibly vulnerable, caught in this bureaucratic limbo.
So what can we do?
Well, the Great Climate Exodus, it calls for clear international agreements
Okay.
that recognize climate displacement, that provide legal protections, and that ensure access to those basic services and support for those who are forced to move.
It feels like we're playing catch up though, right?
Right.
Like trying to build a system for a problem that's already spiraling out of control.
It's definitely a race against time,
Yeah.
but the excerpt makes a powerful argument that the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. Every day that we delay, the problem becomes more complex, it becomes more expensive, and more devastating in its human cost.
So where do we go from here? What can we as individuals actually do about this? It's so easy to feel powerless in the face of such a massive global challenge.
I get that. I get that feeling. And the excerpt acknowledges that those individual actions alone, they won't solve this.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we're powerless. We can still make conscious choices in our own lives, you know? We can reduce our carbon footprint, we can support sustainable businesses, we can advocate for policies that address climate change. But even more importantly, I think, we need to use our voices, our votes, our platforms to demand action from our leaders.
Right.
You know, hold them accountable for creating a more sustainable and equitable future.
So it's not just about changing our light bulbs. It's about changing the system.
Exactly. It's about raising awareness, building movements, and really pushing for that systemic change. Because at its core, this isn't just an environmental issue. It's a social justice issue. It's a human rights issue. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of where they live, has a right to a safe and secure future.
This deep dive has taken us from vanishing islands to global solutions, from personal stories to collective action. It's been heavy stuff, but I have to admit, I'm walking away feeling, I don't know, this strange sense of hope. Is that weird?
Not at all. I think it's easy to get bogged down by the scale of the problem, but the excerpt, it reminds us that we have the capacity to solve this. We have the knowledge, we have the technology, and increasingly, I think, the collective will to actually make a difference.
And that's where the hope lies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we've explored the devastating realities of climate migration, but also, some glimmers of hope in those adaptation and resilience efforts. And for our listeners who want to explore this topic further, we'll have links to some incredible resources and organizations working on climate migration solutions in the show notes. It's time to turn awareness into action. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.